A little boy asked me, he said, "Mr. Tatum," he said, "are you a hero of Iwo Jima?" I said, "No, son. I'm only a survivor. We buried all the heroes." My mother and father were involved in pipelining industry, where they built these huge pipelines across the nation in the early 20s and 30s. We lived in Texas, Oklahoma, Mississippi, all these different places where he built pipelines. And then my father died in 1934 and left my mother with 4 children. To survive, we moved to California and lived with my uncle, who was already here. And when I was 15 years old, World War II broke out, and I was a paper boy at the time. When I was folding papers, I'd read the headlines. We were in deep trouble in America, and everybody wanted to join. If you weren't going to join, they were going to draft you anyway. So I wanted to join the Marine Corps because I felt, God, those guys got the best looking uniforms. So the next several years, until I became 17, I pestered my mother every day to let me join the Marine Corps. And finally, when I got to be 17, I kept pestering her. She said, "If they'll take you, they can have you." So she signed the papers, which your parents had to do at that age, and I went down to the post office with my mother, and she signed for me to join the United States Marine Corps. There's nothing more fun than being a Marine at that time. Here you are with a bunch of young guys. There was nothing to do. There's no newspapers, no radio, and the only thing they did was try and think up tricks to pull on people. You knew you were there for a reason, that somewhere along the line, you're going to go in combat. I don't know anybody that could claim they weren't scared, because here you're going into an island with who knows how many enemies on it, and you're going to be lucky if you make it. I was there 15 days at Iwo Jima. We were on the front lines all the time. My company had 258 men when we went ashore. We left with 38. Not only were they wounded and dead and gone, you're still here. And is it going to happen to you next? At this point, I exceeded my capacity for terror and stress and death and everything. I had combat fatigue. I was doing erratic things, so they kicked me off the island. How many people see somebody they know killed in front of their eyes? And another one, and another one, and another one. I don't care who you are, it's going to affect your thinking. That's the Bronze Star. And that's the medal I received from the Marine Corps for my actions at Hill 362, when I used a machine gun on them to save Steve and Van. 2 of my best friends have just been shot. And in my rage, I ran out there and I grabbed the machine gun and I fired it from the hip into this cave and annihilated the Japanese. When Steve's been carried away on the stretcher, he just kind of gave me the okay sign. Van survived and Steve died during the night. So it was a very traumatic thing to see happen. One of the highlights of my life was being invited to San Francisco. And they had a ceremony where they awarded this to me. And my mother was there to see it. Probably the greatest thrill you could ever have is to be home and know that the war is somewhat behind you at that particular time, and find out that people still loved you and you were with people that you loved. The war was over, and it was kind of a good time for everybody, and you're 19 or 18 years old, and what do you do if the only thing you ever did was be a Marine? So you got to go get a job. But I always wanted to be a race car driver. So I devoted a lot of my life to learning to be a race car driver. And I really liked that. I felt the obligation as a survivor to also relate the events to the people at home. So I wrote a story, my first story, I wrote it about John Basilone. And the Leatherneck bought it and published it for me. And it was called The Death of Manila John Basilone. And after I did that, somebody said, you ought to write the whole story. So I decided to do it. And I started writing the book Red Blood, Black Sand. I owe that to all of them, and to tell the story about these men that fought on Iwo Jima, a battle that cost 6,800 American lives and 30,000 wounded. They can't ever forget this.
Gene was a very gentle person. He was very kind and considerate.
It just was his nature to be very charismatic and very outspoken.
He was a wonderful father, extremely patient at times when I know it must have been trying.
He was a straight shooter. If you asked Eugene a question, he'd give you a straight answer every time.
My father was in many respects a product of the Victorian age. He was born in the 1920s, but his father was very much a Victorian gentleman, and those values deeply suffused his being.
If you remember the movie Gone with the Wind, there was the character in there named Ashley Wilkes that was played by Leslie Howard. Eugene was Ashley personified. Ashley endured the war, Eugene endured the war. Ashley didn't seem to be able to forget the war. Eugene did not seem to be able to forget the war. They were both gentlemen, always gentlemen.
Gene had a very, very happy childhood in Mobile. He was so fortunate in that way. Although he had many childhood illnesses.
My friend Eugene was highly intelligent. He was constantly interested in bird life, any kind of animal life, just an all-around naturalist. When high school came along, we were almost inseparable. We were both in the Murphy High School band. We both played the snare drum.
They were both very interested in the Civil War.
His grandfather had served in the Civil War. There were Civil War veterans in Mobile, Alabama, when he was growing up, that would tell their stories to young men like Sid Phillips and Eugene Sledge. Eugene's dad would let Eugene use the car, and they'd go outside of town to the abandoned Civil War forts.
And a battle had been fought across Mobile Bay at Spanish Fort. And they would go over and dig up all sorts of relics. And then they would go to the local grocery store, and they would have an RC Cola and a moon pie.
At the moment of Pearl Harbor, Eugene was still in high school. He had missed some schooling and had to finish, so I enlisted while Eugene remained at home.
Sidney Phillips was leaving. That was partially why Gene was so anxious to go. Sid was at Guadalcanal and wrote letters home to Gene.
I told Sledge in one of my letters from Guadalcanal that he should join nothing, not even the Girl Scouts, not the Boy Scouts, the Salvation Army. I said, just stay out of everything and anything. Make them draft you if you had to get into the service, but do not join anything.
He decided that the war might end before he could get over there. And so he wanted to join the Marines. He had to ask his parents permission, and his father said, well, they won't take you. You have a heart murmur. He said, well, I want to try anyway. His father was a physician, and he said, let me check you. And there was no heart murmur.
Eugene Sledge was a replacement at Pavuvu after we came off of Cape Gloucester. We always teased Sledge about being a college boy and dropping out of officers training school. He took it real well. He was a good guy to have around the tent. Everything never got dull when he was there.
Eugene was in the 60-millimeter mortars, which is a company weapon.
They shipped out to Peleliu, which was next on the list to be taken out by the Marines. The 1st Marine Division was in the front lines approximately 30 days. He was in combat and under fire that entire time. The next one was Okinawa. The 1st Marine Division landed on Okinawa on April Fool's Day, 1945. He was there, I believe, 82 days on the front lines and in combat at Okinawa.
Gene Sledge did his job and did what he was told to do. You can't ask for any more than that of any man.
Eugene was fine in combat, but combat did not interest him. It horrified him.
There's not a day goes by that I don't think about it. And when I do think about it, I try to force myself to think about the good buddies I had and some of the things that we did that were funny. But then you also remember the dead and how many of them there were. And they were just snuffed out. And there's no way you can forget them.
My buddy Eugene seemed to be haunted by the war.
Gene had nightmares for many years after the war.
My father was particularly bothered by loud bangs, noises, whistles, anything that mimicked artillery fire.
I was probably about 8 years old. I hid in the pantry with my toy Tommy gun. He walked through the room and I jumped out at him. And the next thing I remember was him wheeling around and grabbing me by the shirt and pinning me to the wall. Nothing beyond that happened. I mean, he quickly realized what was going on.
Eugene Sledge had a very difficult time adjusting to civilian life after the war. He was beset, as were many other veterans, with thoughts about why he had survived when so many others had died.
That's one of the cases of war that not only does a man fight in a war, and if he survives, he's got to live with it the rest of his life.
My father would say that one of the worst things about World War II was the complete waste of human life, of human potential, brutalization of the survivors.
His father had treated combat wounded in World War I, and he was very aware of what the men would go through. He told Gene, never feel sorry for yourself. You're safe, you made it through, you're home, you have a life.
What you have to do is to try to focus your mind on other things.
The thing that helped him to conquer the nightmares and the terrible experiences that would flash back into his mind was to start thinking about something in biology. He had found his calling. Biology was his savior.
Ornithology, the study of birds, was really his area of specialty.
He also found that he enjoyed teaching.
My father had a great passion for teaching and was a natural teacher. My father saw himself as a simple scientist with a love of the natural world who had endured something unspeakable and wanted to convey that to later times and other people, and that the best way to do that would be through simply recording what he had observed.
They were not allowed to keep diaries on the front lines, so he had a little New Testament, and he wrote on the pages of that, he would make little notes to help him remember what had happened at what particular point. And when he came home from the war, one of the first things he did was sit down and write out a complete outline of his experiences. It was much, much later, many years, before he went back to it and began filling that in.
He wrote it for his family, for us to know what he had been through and to have some sense of his experience in World War II and something we could pass on to our children.
This is Gene's study. He wrote his book with the old breed at this desk or sitting over in the easy chair. He closed the door and stayed in here for hours writing away.
My first exposure with the old breed was when my mom was typing it. I would read it over her shoulder, and it was just astonishing. It was a surreal experience to think that someone you knew and loved and who was so modest and gentle could have gone through something that horrific and had enough presence of mind to be able to write it down in a coherent fashion and not go mad.
Gene felt that writing the book would lay the war to rest for him.
The experience was so incredibly intense that after it was all over with, life was never the same, because the sunrise is always more beautiful to me now than it ever was before I started into Peleliu on that Amtrak.
He had a great feeling of serenity. He had already been through the worst that life could throw at him, and he knew that he was able to stand up to it.
He was a patriot, let me say that.
Bob was always a joker, always.
He was witty, he was gregarious.
He became pretty much a wild man.
Robert Leckie was one of those young men to find his own way.
My father, Robert Leckie, was a Marine. He was Irish, he was Catholic, and those three things painted his life. My father was the youngest of 8 children. He was born when his mother was 48, so that when he went off to war, she was 70.
I came from a cultivated family. My father was a very cultivated man, and he had a big library. And there were dictionaries and encyclopedias all over the house, and it was an intellectual atmosphere, and you have a head start.
My father had lived in Rutherford, New Jersey, pretty much for his whole life. They lived next door to each other. My mother moved in when she was 12. My grandmother apparently used to refer to him as that fresh kid next door, which I can understand. My father was mischievous, shall we say.
My mother was not too fond of Bob. He had a reputation in the neighborhood as kind of a wild one, and she always said, "Don't go near that Leckie boy."
He had a problem with authority because he thought he knew better than everyone else regarding everything.
From the time he went to school, they were throwing him out all the time.
I was kicked out of high school fairly regularly. I would get on the Passaic River with my dog and smoke cigarettes and watch the oil barge traffic. I waited until I was 21, which was December 18th. I went to Paris Island, and at that time, the course was shortened from 12 weeks to 6 weeks. We were all very green. We were the most high-hearted kids you've ever seen.
He was intrigued by the Marine Corps' statement that it was the best. It was the best service, it had the toughest mission, and it was going to put its Marines eyeball to eyeball with the Japanese. When the Marine Corps puts out that kind of message, it gets a lot of tough kids, like Robert Leckie, young men who have a strength of purpose, a belief in themselves, and a desire to be the best.
Robert Leckie and I were in the same company, which was H Company, 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines. We were both privates, first class, and Robert was in a machine gun platoon, and I was in the mortar platoon. We all called him Lucky. Nobody called him Leckie. He was lucky.
I made private 4 times. I won't discuss the occasions, but I was a wild kid. The last time they gave me a PFC stripe, they said, "Now don't lose it this time." I said, "Then why did you put a zipper on it?" You know?
Robert Leckie was one of the platoon, and he was a good Marine, particularly the night of the Battle of Tenerife.
August 7th, 1942. It was on the Tenerife River. It was called the Ichiki Detachment. It's supposed to be a crack detachment. They attacked my battalion. We killed them all, about 2,200 men or more. We lost 26.
We decimated them over a period of about 12 hours. That came to be known as the Battle of the Tenerife River.
My father had dedicated at my mother's house a park. It is called Tenerife Park. It is dedicated to his 3 best buddies from Guadalcanal through the rest of his time in the Pacific. Lou Juergens, Chuckler, Bill Smith, Hoosier, and Bud Conley, Runner.
And it's also dedicated to all the Marines who were in World War II, who, as he said, foremost fighting fell.
The Second World War was a defining moment in his life. It was always there.
When he came back to this country and we started dating, I felt that he was nervous, he was tense, and it was part of being difficult to get along with him. He had been under a great deal of duress over there. At that time, they didn't get any psychological training. I mean, he went right back and took a job, and he felt he was fine, but actually he wasn't. Bob never spoke to me about his wartime experiences, nor did he ever speak to his children about them. He had terrible nightmares all of his life. I frankly don't feel that he ever got over his experience in the Pacific. They had a terrible struggle, and that makes a terrible impression on a young person. He knew that the war had an impact on him, but he fought it all of his life. He did up until the end. And as he got older, it became more evident.
My dad died of Alzheimer's in 2001, towards the end, where he had forgotten all of us. He never forgot being in the Pacific.
He felt the Japanese were attacking. We have a pond in front of the house. And he'd say, the Japanese are coming over the pond. And where do we go? And I'd say, Bob, there's nothing there.
The Marine Corps was always there.
He was devoted to the Marine Corps all of his life.
There's a huge Marine Corps emblem on the front of his desk.
He loved the Marine Corps. And on his crypt, I have Semper Fi. Because he was very, very fond of the Marines.
The relationship my mother and father had was a working relationship. They were partners in the production of his work.
I had the same typewriter that he lost in the Pacific, and he said it's the only thing that I can really work on. So I said, well, you can borrow it when you would like to. He did borrow my typewriter, and I guess I had to marry him to get it back again. But he did write "Helmet for My Pillow" on this typewriter.
I always wanted to be a writer since I can remember.
Writing was his life. He was a sports writer or a stringer for the Burgin Record when he was 16.
He was discharged, and the next day he went to the Burgin Record and asked for a job back. So he started working within 2 or 3 days after getting out of the Marine Corps. We got married, and he went to the Associated Press up in Buffalo, and then he ran the MGM newsreels. They worked 3 long days to make the newsreel, and in between, he was writing "Helmet for My Pillow."
Helmet for My Pillow was my own experiences, a narrative.
Helmet for My Pillow was my dad's first book. It came out in 1957.
That was the book he really loved. I mean, he put his heart into that book. And he thought that was the be-all and end-all, but it wasn't. I mean, from there, you have to go on and write. So he did magazine articles, he did political writing.
By the time he was done, he had published around 40 books.
He needed to know that people wanted to read what he had to say.
Well, I think I've made a contribution, and I'm pleased with it, and I intend to continue.
And that was my father. He wanted to make an impression, no matter good impression, bad impression, made no difference to him. He made an impression.
John was a live wire.
John really wanted to be a Marine and be with the boys.
He was the first enlisted Marine in World War II to receive the Medal of Honor.
He just had a legion of fans, even among the other Marines there, and of course the ones in his platoon.
He was from a very solid Italian family, and they had a lot of real good values.
John was a very warm person. He embraced everyone, you know, by his good nature. And he was very much like his mother. His mother was very outgoing.
We went to St. Bernard's Roman Catholic School. John's nickname was Bazzy, B-A-S-S-Y. Everybody called him, hey Bazzy here, hey Bazzy there. Short for Basilone. And you could kid with him, you know, because he went right along with you.
John was just an average American guy trying to get through the Depression, get settled down.
John was looking for a job in the worst way. He had to do something, so he tried the Army out. After he put his time in with the Army, he joined up with the Marines. He figured he'd be more action there. That's the type he was.
He was stationed in Manila with the Army, and he pulled some pretty wild liberties in Manila that he got the nickname Manila John Basilone.
He liked liberty. He liked to play.
We went on liberty, he had a big time. But when he came back, he was all duty.
John Basilone was a machine gun section leader. Now, this is a job that in that era was basically like being a very skilled foreman of a very technical trade.
We were under his instructions, his tutelage, as young Marines, learning how to maneuver, fire, and maintain a .30 caliber machine gun.
He really taught us all how to swing the tripod around the back of your neck and grab it by the legs and go with it.
You could blindfold him, you could strip it down, put it back together. It was fantastic what he knew about the machine gun.
He carried the aura of being the first enlisted Marine to receive the Medal of Honor. He was awarded that decoration at the epic Battle of Guadalcanal, an event that all Americans believed was one of the finest hours the country had ever known.
We had a tough time in Guadalcanal. In October, we were pretty well pinned down. When the Japanese hit us on this particular night, October 24 and 25, they hit right in the 8 Company. I saw John twice that night. It was constant fighting. I kept getting word John was doing some miraculous things up on his end, fixing machine guns in pitch black dark and him doing it by his fingers. John piled them up around his gun pretty heavy. I was acting first sergeant at the time and wrote up the citation. He was sort of in awe that he got the Medal of Honor.
They immediately brought him back to the States because they needed to pump up the war bond sales.
They kind of put the squeeze on him to go sell war bonds. He really didn't want to go.
John was a pretty famous individual. He traveled with movie stars. The girls, they'd all crowd around him.
They took him to his hometown of Raritan, New Jersey, and 50,000 people turned out for his parade.
It was a sea of humanity. All you could see were faces. They were shoulder to shoulder. You couldn't move. Once you got in the crowd, you just couldn't move.
Sitting on a curb here in Raritan, I knew something special was happening. The roar of the crowd, the enthusiasm. I'd never seen a parade like that in my entire life. And John made a speech.
I want to thank you, Judge Algard, and these very good home folks of Raritan for this wonderful gift. It's for all my buddies overseas and the front lines that they really appreciate everything you people, you wonderful people are doing by backing the attack and buying these war bonds.
They presented John with a $5,000 war bond. There were all types of festivities.
I was in the Boy Scouts. I was a shy boy, so I was underneath the stands when my mother and father were on the car.
Knowing him before and after the medal, there was very little change in his disposition, his attitude.
You'd have never known from his lips that he had a Medal of Honor.
He hanging around his neck when they had a parade, and that was it. He got tired of bond sales quick.
He didn't really like making speeches.
He was a Marine. He wasn't a salesman. He did a certain amount of it and walked into an officer and said, I want the fleet again, meaning the Fleet Marine Force, and that's when he went back.
The commandant got him transferred and sent him to Camp Pendleton.
We were really close buddies. Almost every weekend we'd catch the train and go to L.A. He didn't have any trouble finding dates or anything. Lena cured all that. Lena was pretty well under control woman. She kind of was in charge, I think. She was in charge among the women Marines in the kitchen, and she was in charge with him.
One day he called my father and he said, send me $500, I'm gonna get married.
The wedding was a short wedding. It wasn't a long affair. It was a fun time and it was a great group. But I was best man. She loved him, and I know that he really loved her. It was John's desire to go back and be with the boys. And when we shipped out, it was full-time service.
I never dreamed in my wildest dreams that he and I would be reunited on the beach at Iwo Jima.
I went in on the initial wave. I think John went in on the fourth. I was about 3/4 way up the hill to where we flattened out when I heard him hollering and coming up behind us.
He's kicking people and cussing them and telling them, get off the beach, get going.
He joined us and we moved on up and did our turn towards the airport.
Basilone and I and about 15 other guys take off up to the airport.
We made it all the way to the airport and went down into the first revetment. John said something about, you better bring the guys back. We're getting a lot of shell fire.
And we take refuge in this big shell hole. Basilone says, you guys stay here, I'm going to go back and get more troops. And he left us there, and he told us, stay here, come hell or high water. And he went back, and I don't know how long he was gone. In our dismay and horror, Basilone was killed in the first couple of hours of combat on Iwo Jima. The word really spread fast all over the island that Basilone was dead. It's like something you couldn't believe. How could this happen to our hero?
He was killed on February 19th, 1945. But about a week or so later, we got the word. I remember the police chief in Raritan coming around town in a loudspeaker announcing that John Basilone was killed in action at Iwo Jima. And the church bells at St. Anne's, where he went to school, were ringing.
In 1948, the statue of John Basilone is dedicated in Raritan, New Jersey. And Lena came out a year later, and she met John's family at the statue. They also went to the commissioning of the United States John Basilone.
If you go to Raritan, his hometown, you don't have any trouble finding Basilone memorials. They have a Basilone parade. It's a big thing. The whole state comes.
There won't be anybody like him. You know, he was really a gung-ho Marine.
He came from nothing to greatness. I think that's what we all want, the guy that didn't have anything that made it. He just went off and became great, became a world hero. You know, a whole country honored him.
Some of the greatest men on earth, I think, I fought with. Some of the bravest men. Never got medals or never was considered heroes, but I always thought they were. I was raised on a farm. There were 7 of us children, 4 boys and 3 girls, and I was the 3rd child, oldest boy. I was into everything that was baseball, basketball, football, track, anything that was going on, I was involved in it. I don't even remember the first time I ever went fishing or the first time I ever went hunting. I've done that all my life, and I've always enjoyed the outdoors. When the war started, I was working in Dallas, making 30 cents an hour. I joined the Marine Corps because I knew that they were the best, and I've always had an attitude to be the very best that I could be at whatever I was doing.
Val Burgin, tough guy from Texas, and he was an outstanding mortarman and leader. And K Company was very lucky to have men like Burgin.
You become family. You do care a lot about your men. And one thing that I always tried to do is to put my men in position the best that I could. I didn't want to be getting any of my men killed or wounded. I don't think that I had a man in my outfit that wouldn't fight for me until this day. I was trained for the 60 millimeter mortars. I learned to be an observer on the front lines and call back data to the guns for the shells to land. And I did that on Peleliu, and I also did that on Okinawa. We landed on Peleliu on September 15, 1944. We hit the beach with 235 men in the K Company. But when we were relieved, there was 85 of us still standing. We lost a lot of men. It was very distressful, very demoralizing, and you get to the point that you don't particularly give a damn where you live or die. The one thing about the battle, it's kind of like a football game or any other sport. When you first start the game, you're tense and high energy, and after you've been there a couple of 3 days and in the battle, you calm down, and it's just your job and not just what you do. A bunch of ordinary men doing some extraordinary things. And Okinawa was my 3rd one to go through, and it beginning to wear on me. The mental part of it was tough. We started up the ridge, and a machine gunner would open up and pin us down. It wounded 2 or 3, and I thought, well, if I can get around that ridge that was sticking up there, I'll spot him by the muzzle velocity whenever he fires. And sure enough, he opened up, and whenever he did, I saw fire coming out of the machine gun, so I knew exactly where he was at. He was after me. He put 2 bullet holes in my dungaree between my knee and my ankle, and 1 bullet hole in my right dungaree. I went back around the little knoll, called in on the mortars and fired 1 round, and then made my adjustment from that. And the 2nd round, got a direct hit on that. They awarded me the Bronze Star for knocking that machine gun out. I don't think that a man could come through what I went through and not have the Lord looking after him. So that's the only explanation that I can give that why I came through it with only a wound and not to get killed in action. Just because God was looking after me. That's what I asked him to do. And he did. After my discharge, I tried my damnedest to forget everything that ever went on. And I did a pretty good job of that, too. I didn't talk about the war to my family. I never talked about the war to my co-workers. I never talked about the war, period. For 35 straight years. Never missed it. I started going to the reunions in 1980, and that loosened up a lot of closed gates. Well, the most important thing in my life was meeting Florence. I met her in Australia in 1943. I guess I immediately fell in love with her because we corresponded from day one, dated for about 4 months. Wasn't long then until I had to sail out. He
came in and he had his dungarees on and his boots. And I said, "What is going on?" He said, "We're shipping out." Now, I'll admit I cried the night that he left, but he also told me, he said, "I will come back and get you." And so
I didn't. I just sent for her. I think I would have married her in Australia, but I couldn't see going to war and not coming home and leaving her in Australia by herself. I just figured it was better to wait until after the war and then get married, and all the risk would be over as far as me getting killed or anything.
He's always been a good father and a good provider.
Whenever I first started to work at the post office, I was a letter carrier, and I worked my way up to superintendent. I was good for the post office, and the post office was good to me. I made it a 31-year career and retired the day I was 55 years old and never looked back.
So it was good.
I don't feel like I'm a hero. I feel like that I was just a man, like a man that goes to work every day and comes home and goes back to work the next day. I feel like that I went over there to do a job, and I did the best job that I could do. And it was a heroic, no, I wasn't a hero, still not a hero.